I can tell you in some real sense, it's akin on the Christian front to making the statement that the true ruler of reality is the satanic spirit. It's the same idea, and that's a hell of a claim, man, to literally speaking. And so, but it is the case that almost every institution and almost every person has a touch of the evil uncle as part of their structure. You know, there's no doubt that
Prince Andrew.
Well,
it does kind of take us back there.
Well, but everyone. So imagine that to some degree you're not as good an advocate for yourself as you might be.
I don't need to imagine that.
Well, okay, so you know that.
Yeah,
okay, so then imagine there's part of your character that's sort of set against you. Yeah. And it would be set against you because, well, you might doubt whether life has any fundamental meaning, and you might be annoyed and irritated because you've been hurt and betrayed in various ways, and your development might have been stunted because you hit obstacles and you didn't explore them enough, and so your way was barred, and so there's a part of your character that is set against you, and you have to contend with that part and hopefully overcome it or integrate it, which is a better way of thinking about it. And then that's the same for your relationship with your wife, and then that's the same for your relationship with your kids, and it just scales all the way up. And then you can say, well, look, you're corrupt. And the truth of the matter is, well, you are to some degree, but the to some degree is actually the crucial issue here. You know?
Absolutely. So, I guess that's where we go back to the criticism I guess I made of the Queen in the first place. That's part of the problem with the discourse around it, I guess, at the moment, or the conversation is, if I criticize the Queen in the time when we're mourning, the immediate reply is, not the time. But that's always the response with the Queen and with Andrew. This isn't the time, you know, don't talk about it like this. And so there never really seems to be a time. But also at the same time, when I do have a legitimate criticism, people go, well, you're anti-monarchist then. I go, well, not necessarily. I've just got a criticism of what happens there. So we can't have a nuanced, reasonable conversation. That's the thing.
Well, people don't really like nuance that much because here's
doesn't fit on a TikTok, unfortunately.
I had a conversation with a great physicist, Roger Penrose, and Penrose has this obsession with tiling. So he designs tiles, and he's interested in the mathematics of tiling, and it's in some sense a strange interest. And so, but he's a genius, and so whenever I see a genius and he has a strange interest, I think that's probably related to his genius in some way, because after all, he's a genius. And so I thought a lot about his obsession with tiling. Outside the building he works in at Oxford, the land outside is covered with a tile that he designed that has certain mathematical properties that I don't know enough about to describe in detail. But I was very interested psychologically in the idea of tiling. So imagine that you have a surface, an uneven and rough surface that's very complicated, like an uneven and rough surface is. It's extremely highly detailed, right? And it's got undulations, and it's made out of dust, and the dust is made out of, you know, atoms at the finest level of resolution. Well, you can go even finer than that. It's very complicated, any surface. Now, when you tile it, you simplify it, right? Because each tile, in some sense, is homogeneous. That's sort of what makes it a tile. It's one piece. So you take this thing that's extremely complex and you put a simpler representation on top of it. And so one of the things I've learned about people is that we all tile the whole cosmos. So you have a model of the entire universe. Now you think, well, how can you? Because what the hell do you know? And the answer is, you use really big tiles. So imagine what you know about Serbia. You know, maybe you know a lot about Serbia, but I'm going to assume you don't.
My wife's from Kosovo, so I know a fair bit.
So but then you think you know a fair bit. It's like, well, maybe you could identify where it is located on a map. If you had a map, you probably couldn't draw the map.
I disagree with a few people about what Serbia is and isn't on a map, if I'm honest.
Okay, well, that's also a problem. But imagine, you could probably point to Serbia on a map, but then I could say, well, could you draw that map without looking at a map? Could you draw a map of Europe accurately without looking at it? Now, maybe you could, but most people certainly can't. But they could point to it. Mm-hmm. So imagine people have a representation of the whole world, but it's really, 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 really low resolution. It's sort of, you can see this if you get people to do something like, well, do you know what a helicopter is? It's like, yes. Can you draw one? Mm-hmm. So they draw it. It looks like a 3-year-old drew a helicopter. It's like it's got rotors. It's like 4 parts: rotors, ball, stick, ball. That's a helicopter. It's like, no, it's not. especially not if it's a military helicopter. I think you have to, for a military helicopter to fly, you need 35 hours of maintenance for every hour it's in the air. And the reason for that is, well, they're rocks, like they're a solid piece of metal, you know, they just plummet, they don't fly, and keeping those things in the air is really complicated, and you have to know the helicopter in unbelievably great detail in order to actually make it work. And so when you say you know what a helicopter is, you might say, well, what do you mean? And your answer is something like, well, I know one well enough so that if I walk by it, it doesn't explode. It's something like that. And so your representation is good enough so that in your normal course of affairs, you can use it to navigate through the world. And that's how you adjudicate your knowledge. And so if you never go to Russia, you can have a really low resolution representation of Russia, and it doesn't matter. Now, the devil's in the details, let's say. You talked about a nuanced conversation. Well, let's say you're an environmentalist. Well, that's what you say, and that's a claim to moral virtue. And you say, okay, well, what do you mean you're an environment? Well, I think we should serve the planet. It's like, well, what do you mean the planet? And, well, what do you think the big issue is? Well, it's carbon. It's like, well, is it really? What about overfishing? What about despeciation? What about soil degradation? What about the idea that if you made people richer, they would become more environmentally conscious, and so maybe the best way to clean the planet is by making the poor people rich, which, by the way, seems to be the case, and so on. And what about setting aside marine protected areas? What about how much land should we preserve on Earth so that we can grow crops optimally but still maintain the natural balance? How would you define ecodiversity? Do you know how many species are propagating compared to how many are going extinct? And the answer is, you don't know any of that. And so that also means you're not an environmentalist. It also means that I've just shone a light on your claim that you're an environmentalist, showing you that it's unbelievably shallow and just a false virtue signaling flag. And so you can't have a nuanced conversation, because what you do is you tell people, you say to people, you're using a very big tile to cover an awful lot of snakes, like thousands of them or hundreds of thousands of them. And I'll just lift up the tile and show you the snakes. And some of those snakes are you and your pretension that your tile actually constitutes knowledge, which it doesn't. And so if you have a nuanced conversation and you show that you understand the details, at least to some degree, then you're a threat to the integrity of the person's worldview. So you replace that unity with a complex and anxiety-provoking multiplicity, and you also illuminate their pretension to moral virtue. And so it's no bloody wonder they don't like you. It's like, oh, you said, this is way more complex than you think. You have no entitlement to moral virtue as a consequence of your low-resolution claim.
You do that. You lift up the lid a lot, and you know you've got security here. I was wondering.
Good guys.
Lovely man.
Yeah, they're really good.
I was wondering.